Good evening, everyone. If I could ask you to take your seats, we're just about ready to start. There we go. Good evening. My name is Jane Gilbert. Welcome to Why Forests Matter. We're so delighted that you could join us here this evening. Why Forests Matter is sponsored by our partner in forest conservation, TD Bank Group. My name's Jane Gilbert. I'm with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. In fact, I'm the Nature Conservancy of Canada's Chief Storyteller. Well, that's not really my title. My title is Chief Communications Officer, but what I do is tell stories about nature and about our work to conserve nature, including forests. And I'm delighted to be your host and moderator this evening. Actually, it's a special pleasure for me to be here tonight, to be here back in this wonderful city in Halifax. I used to live here, and when I think about the title, Why Forests Matter, quite often what comes to my mind is Halifax. It was during the time that I lived here. I lived out on Tower Road, down in the South End, about 8 doors from Point Pleasant Park. And although it was a lovely little apartment, Point Pleasant Park was my backyard, and it's where I spent an awful lot of time contemplating marriage, career, life. So forests did matter a lot to me at that point in time, and Point Pleasant Park mattered a lot to me. Forests do matter for a whole lot of reasons. So thank you for coming and choosing to spend your Tuesday evening here with us. The bar will be open and snacks will be provided at the end of this discussion, and I say that to entice you to stay through to the end. But we will have refreshments and a chance to continue the discussion after the formal panel session is finished. This event is organized by the Nature Conservancy of Canada. We are an organization best known for protecting some of Canada's most important natural areas and species. In addition to the nature work we work hard to conserve, we also aspire to get Canadians talking about nature, about what nature means to all of us and why nature is important. And that's part of what we're doing here tonight. Why Forests Matter is an event series that actually began in Toronto, and it's now traveling across Canada. We hope that these events will encourage the public to think and, more importantly, to talk about nature. And tonight our speakers will help us start that conversation. Our 5 speakers come to us with very different perspectives and from very different professions and backgrounds, and each has a personal connection to forests, and each has a story to tell us about their experiences with forests. And before I invite them to come on stage, let me first give you a brief picture of our speakers. Tonight, we're fortunate to have Jeff Amos, a local, one-of-a-kind, sustainable wood furniture maker, designer, and builder extraordinaire. Anne Simpson is also with us. Anne is a prized Canadian writer and poet hailing from Antigonish. Peter Duinker, a professor of resource and environment studies at Dalhousie University, is with us this evening. Karen Clarke-Whistler is the CEO of TD Bank Group. Well, CEO, she is the Chief Environment Officer of TD Bank Group. And that's quite a unique position, particularly in the banking community. And our final speaker is the Nature Conservancy of Canada's own Dan Kraus. He is our Director of Conservation and Program Development. Now, for more details about our speakers, their bios are provided on the back of this evening's program, and you'll have an opportunity to meet with them during the reception a little later and perhaps chat with them further about some of the discussion this evening. Now let's hear from our fabulous speakers about why forests matter. Oh, I will mention that this is one of those occasions where looking at your cell phone is a good thing, so long as you're looking at Twitter. And we are using the hashtag Forests Matter this evening, so spread the word, please. At the end of our short moderated discussion, we'll invite the audience then to continue with some Q&A and some conversation and questions for our panel. So a big thank you to TD Bank Group for sponsoring this important dialogue tonight and for its continued involvement with conservation right across Canada. Karen, please pass along our thanks to your colleagues. And now, without further ado, I'd like to invite Jeff Amos to take the stage. And Jeff, why don't you kick it off for us?
Good evening, everybody. My name is Jeff Amos. I've been working with wood for a very long time, and it's those little bits and pieces of detail that I would like to convey to you, but I'm going to tell it through stories of others. Curiously, it's stories. But I'd like to start by saying I'd speak in the language of Ent, courtesy of Mr. Tolkien, but your human ears would not and could not hear that language. If we were in forest, human words would not be needed, for each of you would be able to feel forest. But this evening is an evening of human words. However, this is not my usual kind of place, so I need to start by rooting myself as deep as a tree. And as I find that trunk rising and thickening to hold the crown that is the world's best solar collector, I feel I am then able to speak to you from a place that I am more than a little familiar with. But again, this is from stories from others that I'd like to emphasize. For example, a boy I knew that was in grade 3 or 4, he figured out that if he ran through the field, he could short-circuit the bus getting him to school. So he would wait by the bus, and he'd see the bus go, and he'd beetle off through the fields and get through a little patch of woods and be on the way to school. But this one particular day, as he entered the woods, it was one of those sublime moments, he told me, where the sun coming in, where the trees, the rose, the iris, the bumblebees, it was one of those perfect moments. And as I came to know that guy, he would tell that story fairly often. This is a boy in grade 3 and 4. That boy's father they were walking along a road or a trail, wasn't clear, but the boy saw a vista of forest. Now, how old and how big is a boy in grade 3 or grade 4? But when he saw, he says, the vista of forest that rolled out and undulated before him for miles and miles, it mattered. I knew students in university, and they tell lots of stories. And through time and where I am now, I meet lots of people in universities as well. Studies in ecology and biology. This one student told me about he and a friend climbing a 60-foot rock cut to great peril, as it turned out. One hand, one knee, no footing, a broken root. Look over your shoulder, he says, and the maples of spring not yet leafed were whispering, "Pay attention." It seemed to have mattered to that young guy. He told me also about an honors project he did in a little corner Ontario woodlot, the maple lots, where the family would have a patch of maple trees to harvest sugars from. And the student was doing a study on snowmobile trails and how it impacted the mice. As the snowmobile went over, it froze through the snow, through the ground, and then provided a barrier for the mice. So he was live trapping these little guys and tagging them and releasing them and so on. One day, he says he went into the woods and something was wrong. Something was wrong. It was the energy in that forest. It wasn't a big forest, but 20 acres, give or take. But all indications were something was wrong. Now these traps were, he tells me they were about yay big in the square ends to mice to get in and out about yay long. And then he found why. It's because a squirrel had got in there and panicked itself to death. And the woods was speaking about it, that the student could hear. That same student, as he was leaving university, sat in the trees of those giant maple trees, pondering what his life was going to be when he was now finished school and was out on his own, finally, away from parents and university, on his own. What was life going to be? Sitting in the crotch of a giant maple tree. That student earned his way through school by working in Jasper National Park. The hitchhiking back and forth was cause for a lot of stories, one of them being after all the hours of getting through the boreal forest in northern Ontario, to wake up in the transition zone coming off the rock and the boreal of Ontario and into the beginning of Manitoba, and realizing there was a lake in front of him. The lake that turned into a sea of grass. That same guy told me about photographing in Grasslands National Park, an incredible contrast to forest, and yet such a similarity for the enormity of vegetative growth. In mid-20s, I knew a guy who went to work for Procter & Gamble. He was part of 150 guys who didn't know a whole bunch. They thought they could train them. Stood the bunch of them on the edge of 1,000,000 acres and said, okay, start here and finish there. 1,000,000 acres in northern Alberta. And they started, and they cut, and it was all going to get turned into Pampers diapers. He tells me of cutting in the winter. The snow was quite deep, and it was 40 below. And you'd be up against a tree this big, he'd say, and you'd cut it, and you'd lean back just as that butt whistled up past your nose. There was no felling for direction, you were just felling them into the cut. They did realize that sawing some of those logs was a good idea. He tells me of the entranced place in northern BC that he and a bunch of his friends bought. The goal was to touch wilderness in all that could be touched by living in it. Where do you build a tree house? Or a tree house. A log house. 'Tis a tree house. Where do you put a house on 160 acres when the only choice, the only prerogative is your own? It took the guy a little bit to figure that out. The first tree was cut by axe, as if in ceremony. The company was wolves and bears and hummingbirds, harlequin ducks and moose. He used to run through the forest rather naked just because it felt so good to be able to. The trails the creatures had already provided were more than perfect running. Coming to a porcupine, this tall guy saw this porcupine. Looked like an old man with a tuxedo. But then he began to realize, well, what was funnier, a 6-foot white naked thing on 2 legs, or a porcupine who was in perfect porcupine place? The log house did get built, which was an amazing thing all by itself, given the experience level, and crude furniture. Was the beginning of that young guy's wondering more about wood. What all could you do with it? Then there's the walk up a trail that got started in June of 1866. Somehow he got wind of it. It's called the Telegraph Trail, developed by the Western Union Extension Company. Walking that trail was heading into wilderness beyond count. Had he got off the trail, it would have been a very long 2 weeks to get back, if he had been able to, for hunger and so on. Stepping out into a meadow and looking back at the trees, which were the only mark of how you would find your way back in, and walking away from that point to return a week or 2 later to find that spot. Seeing the echoes of men having carved something in those big trees to say that they had been there. It was still there. Now it's the guy's in his late 20s, and he decided to come to Nova Scotia, furniture wannabe. They begin an intimate journey of wood, species, fine steel, straight and square edges, perfect curves. Ingrained shavings, 2 of walnut, 1 of yellow cedar, put between 2 pieces of glass to become something that was perfect in its own right, yet they were the shavings, the byproduct, apparently the byproduct of a good woodworker. Then this guy in his 40s, the camera loomed again, took him places, the driftwood of BC, the clear cuts of BC, the gut of those places, the ancient yellow cedar, Carmanah Valley. To be with camera in the Carmanah Valley, he says, was an experience so enlightening by size and light and overwhelming growth that existed because it did. Around 40, that all got going. The fellow was involved in conservation, attended a conference in Guelph, Ontario, and was reminded by BC Fisheries, extolling the virtues, how they were resurrecting so many salmon streams. The young guy didn't have a voice much yet. He was only 40. And I had to leave the room because he would have screamed at, well, if you hadn't destroyed the salmon streams with logging practices, you wouldn't have had to resurrect them. And that pushed the guy now into his 50s to get involved in forestry issues through a mixed pot of social, environmental, economic, and First Nations considerations with the Forest Stewardship Council. He spent a fair share of time doing that, and the organization gave him an award, flew him out to Toronto, and said, yeah, you got 2 minutes to speak. Well, what do you say in 2 minutes, the guy said. Well, he pondered on this one and then thought, okay, 12,000 years ago, where we sit here as well as there was 2 kilometers of ice. And in 12,000 years, there is an Acadian forest system here of unimaginable wealth and richness, versatility, diversity, value on how many fronts. Just take the time to look and to feel. At that point, in his 50s, he was logging 450 acres with horses, experiencing a great many realities of return on effort, effect in the forest, the astonishing reality of forest seen this way. Then he got in his late 50s and thought, well, after that effort with the Forest Stewardship Council, what's another venue for talking forest values? And he thought the retail floor of a small woodworking outfit would be the place. There's an expression kids use, not. If there's 5 minutes every 6 months to talk of some real value, it's really quite something. That company, he says, went through a recession in 08, 09, and curiously, that little business in Blockhouse, Nova Scotia, had the same sales record as the curves of the Toronto Stock Exchange for the year 2011. Something is tied together. What is it? We were workers in wood. He says that customer expectations are really quite phenomenal, where there is no understanding of where their high grade of material comes from for the effort and the toil in the forest, the intelligence that must be used in good logging practices, the sheer work, if nothing else. What does this say of the value of our Acadian forest, which because of economic downturn in the forest industry at large is having half a chance to regroup and regain? Now can there be political will to find meaningful courses for the years ahead to truly set our forest back onto a forest of values, not commodity? And then they decided they'd bring the country to the city and open on Agricola Street. Then this guy's getting on a little. He's early geezerhood now, and he told me of writing notes for this evening on his deck in the twilight, the perfect light amongst so many. Jazz softly on the CBC, crickets vibrating all around, 3 barred owls jousting in calls, because it is still their world. Do you hear them? Do you really hear them? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I want you all to close your eyes. And I want you to think of your favorite tree, maybe a tree that you climbed when you were young. Did you have a maple tree that you climbed? Or my friend had a linden tree in which she played tag with the other kids. Han Shan was a hermit monk in ancient China, and he lived on Cold Mountain, and he used to suspend his poems from trees. And he would scribble poems on rocks, and so I like to think of the poems scrolling out of the trees and scribbled on rocks. They'd vanish in the next rainstorm. It was Han Shan who came to mind when Susan McCaslin, who's a poet in British Columbia, heard that an area of forested land in Langley, BC, was to be sold for the development of country estates, and I think a recreation complex. So the Watchers of Langley Forest, or WOLF, which is the acronym, were told in the summer of 2012 that one portion of the land will be taken off the market. So that portion was McClellan Park West, and it was about 25 acres or so. But that the other portion, McClellan Park East, so another 25 acres, that would be sold. And the Watchers of Langley Forest were told they had 2 months in which to raise $3 million if they wanted to save the land. So Susan McCaslin, who's a poet, remember, she went to work. And first she organized something she called Art in the Park, and she had 160 students from the Langley Fine Arts School come in big yellow school buses, and they poured out of the buses, and they went into the woods, and they drew pictures of the trees, they photographed the trees, they made music in the woods. So this was one thing that she did. And then she and her husband heard that Robert Bateman, the famous Canadian wildlife artist, was going to be signing books in a nearby mall. And so they called him and they said, "Will you come?" And he came. And he spoke to the media. And then McCaslin decided that she would call on her poet friends. And she began something she called the Han Shan Project, after Han Shan, the hermit monk. Within a week, she had collected almost 200 poems about trees. And she selected the poems, and she printed them, she put them in plastic sleeves, and she hung them from trees in McClellan Park East in a sort of a gallery. And she sent each person, each of the poets, was sent a photograph of his or her poem. If we lose our forests, we lose our refuges, we lose vast corridors for wildlife that we can't possibly restore, but we also lose something very vital that shapes us as a people. And so if you try to think of Canada without its forests, it's almost unimaginable. To lose our forests would be to lose our spirit. As my husband said this summer, when we were hiking through the ancient Cedars Trail near Whistler, BC, with our daughter, he said, "A forest is magical." I was asking them both what they thought of when they thought of forests. And he said, "It's magical," which is true. He's right. The trees that we saw there were over 1,000 years old, and you couldn't help but touch those trees. They were just so sculptural and so, it's exactly what Jeff was talking about. They're so sensuous and so beautiful as, works of art. And they stand there as sort of historical monuments. And the woods themselves are liminal thresholds, and they're the places where things are unknown to us. Dante, who depicts himself as a central character in the Inferno, finds himself in the selva oscura, in the dark wood, because he has lost his way in the middle of his life, in the middle of his journey. In Russian folk stories, Vasilisa the Beautiful discovers Baba Yaga in her woodland hut. And if you remember those stories, the huts are on chicken legs, or Baba Yaga's hut is on chicken legs. And so it's that story probably that was the antecedent for Hansel and Gretel, who also go into the woods, and they come to the witch's hut, the witch's house, which is sort of an incredible edible house. There's a wonderful willow tree in The Lord of the Rings, and it snags Frodo, and then it holds Pippin and Merry fast until Tom Bombadil comes and rescues them. And there are other wonderful forests in The Lord of the Rings. Of course, you know them, I'm sure. The Golden Wood, Lothlorien. And then there's Fangorn, Treebeard. One of the Ents says this: "Aye, there was all one wood once upon a time, from here to the mountains of Loon, and this was just the east. Those were broad days." Canada has its own legends, and there's a wonderful Huron creation tale of a tribe of sky people who live in longhouses in the clouds. One sky woman asks her husband to uproot the celestial tree in the center of the village, but when he does so, she tumbles through the air, and she's rescued in the nick of time by a Canada goose, and then she's placed on the back of the great turtle, which is North America. What unites all of these tales is the way that they spring from human desires and fears. Our imaginations need both the light and the dark to be fully formed, but without our real forests, we will inevitably lose our myths and our tales. Let me return to the Han Shan project. What happened to that forest in Langley, BC? A woman named Anne Blau had been reading all the news articles, all the media, and she and her husband had picnicked in that very parcel of land, in that very area, and they had loved the woods when they were young. And so Thomas Blau had died a few years prior to this, and she wanted a way to remember him. And she talked to her children, and they decided that she would buy the land, so it was $3 million. And it grants Langley Township and students at a nearby university and the general public access to that land for environmental research, education, and recreation. Yet without the Han Shan project, Anne Blau might not have known the plight of the forest. So we think that words can't do anything, but they can, and I think that poetry actually is a great form of activism. So I'll read you, I hope I still have time. We're challenged here with the amount of time, but I'll read you the poem that I sent to Susan McCaslin. So this is called In the Night Cathedral, a Tree. Once before waking, I saw the tree. Its branches could have been made by a jeweler. Wild dark, coyote dark, and a tree glowing. Northern lights, ice-thin music. No woodcutter in this story, only the tree taller than any other inside you. Not the one outside the kitchen window, skirts high above the ground. The tamaracks dropped needles, pulling gold threads under snow. Not the wonder boom, ancient fig, surrounded by its ring of daughters. Not the dragon tree of Ico de los Vinos. Not the Arbra de Tenere, last acacia of the desert. Inside the night cathedral of your life, is a tree without name, carrying the names of other trees, a tree candled on fire but not burning, brushed with radiance, each branch, each tassel, the tip of each needle. Thanks.
Good evening, Halifax. My name is Peter Duinker. I'm a professor at Dalhousie University. For those of you who know me, you know how deeply forests and trees matter to me. In fact, they matter so deeply that I'm wearing a tie this evening to recognize my strength of feeling for trees. For 35 years, I've been a scholar of trees and forests, and for 57 years, as far back as I can remember, I've been a fanatic about trees. I am an advocate for better forest management everywhere, and especially more trees in all of our urban areas. So why do forests matter? I must acknowledge, first of all, that forests are not only trees. They are composed of thousands of other species, plant and animal, but the focus tonight is indeed on trees, and they wouldn't be forests if it weren't for the trees. So we'll talk more about trees than forests during my time here. Forests matter because of the trees. So let's look at it from the perspective of the trees. Some of my recent research at Dalhousie University has focused on citizen values in relation to trees in the city. We've done research in 4 Canadian cities, all the way from Calgary to here in Halifax. We've used multiple methods, and we have asked, why are trees important to you? And these would be people who reside and work and play in cities. The answers come in dozens and dozens of categories of words. We summarized this last year in a paper in which this is the banner in support of trees in the city. I was thinking of bringing you all a paper copy tonight, but you can find it on the internet if you Google that title. So what did we find and what did we report? What we reported in this short brochure is a selection of 22 of probably 40 or 50 items we could have had in the list. This range of urban forest values spans the gamut from social to ecological to economic to health-related, a huge range of reasons why people say forests and trees are important to them. What I want to point out to you on this list this evening is to just back off from several of them and have you reflect with me how many of those can be related to people's health, both their mental health and their physical health. You might say, what do you mean increased property values? I'm a property owner. I'm pretty happy about that tree in front of my yard, of my house, because it raises the value of my home. Just to give you one example. So I figure that this little lady has it right. She knows that trees make her healthy and happy. She knows that partly because she's my granddaughter and she hangs out at my house, and I tell her that trees make her happy and healthy, and she kind of agrees with me. And I think she's got that kind of smile on her face that would agree. We also need to recognize, though, that there are healthy and happy people in places where there are no trees. In Iqaluit, for example, I don't think there are very many trees. I've looked and I've asked people who've been there, and there aren't any. But, on the other hand, where we can grow trees, people are way better off for them. So I titled my talk, Trees and Forests, World's Best Sources of Vitamin N. And in the program, you'll see that the organizers thought you should know that that meant nature. Richard Louv popularized this in his book, The Nature Principle, but also he had a previous book called Last Child in the Woods. And in that book, he spoke about the concept of nature deficit disorder. Pretty awful sounding. In this book on the nature principle, where he talks about eradicating nature deficit disorder, he defines the nature principle this way, and I quote, "It's the reconnection to the natural world is fundamental to human health, well-being, spirit, and survival." Let me say it again. Reconnection to the natural world is fundamental to human health, well-being, spirit, and survival. He, like me, would argue that trees are a fundamental part of nature in this part of the world. What I want to do is relate to you and summarize in 45 seconds each 3 studies of many dozens, possibly hundreds of studies that have tried to investigate what trees mean to people from a health perspective. We start with this one. One of the oldest and best referenced studies about the health effects of trees. And Professor Ulrich was working in Pennsylvania taking data in the 1970s from 23 patients who had gallbladder surgery and could look out their recuperation window at trees, and 23 patients who had the same gallbladder surgery and had to look out at a brick wall through the window. Now, the pictures you see here are not his. They're out of a bedroom in my house. And if I look north, I can see trees on the left window, and if I look east, I can see the neighbor's house. Now, granted, the neighbor's house looks better than a brick wall, and we could do better with the trees because they are Norway maple, and those of you who know me know that, Norway maple's Norway maple, and we can do better than that. But let's go back to Ulrich's study. The people with the forest view had a shorter hospital stay, fewer negative comments to staff during recuperation, used weaker painkillers, and had fewer complications. Small study, but still pretty powerful. Let's think about the concept of forest bathing, which, if I get the pronunciation right in Japanese, is Shinrin-yoku. Ching Li is a professor at the Nippon Medical School, and he's the president, and get this, he's the president of the Japanese Society of Forest Medicine. I think we need a Halifax Society of Forest Medicine. I don't want to be the president, though. But anyway, Ching Li tested a group of subjects that he took on a trip to the woods, but he controlled by taking other groups of people on trips to the city. Presumably, the trips to the city didn't profile trees, and found that there was a significantly raised immune function in the people who visited the woods. And other studies have also been done on Shinrin-yoku to show that there's an improved mood of participants. Indeed, quite a bit of stress reduction. I'm happy to report that I was engaged in forest bathing this afternoon by having spent 2 hours in Point Pleasant Park, just 1 kilometer from here, with my students. And many of those students are in the crowd. Are you feeling better this evening? I'll bet you are. We should do that every week instead of sitting in the classroom looking out the window at a brick wall. The final study that I'll just make mention of has to do with a very contemporary issue for some cities in Canada, and certainly a pretty serious issue in the United States. Researcher Donovan has been working on looking at the effects of emerald ash borer on tree mortality and then on the subsequent effects on human health. Emerald ash borer, according to his papers, killed tens of millions of ash trees in the US by 2012. It was only found in the US in 2002, and it's moved its way all the way, at least to Montreal now, and we have considerable mortality of ash trees throughout that entire corridor from Windsor up to the Montreal area. Donovan used county-level data in 15 states. He looked at emerald ash borer caused ash mortality and the human mortality in these states before emerald ash borer and during. He found higher human mortality caused by cardiovascular and respiratory illness in areas with higher emerald ash borer-induced tree mortality. So it's not a cause-effect study, it's correlational, but it gives indications enough for Donovan to conclude that it looks like trees contributed quite positively to human health. So let's come to a conclusion. Can trees impair human health? Well, of course they can. Pollen allergies are not unknown to us, and we can talk about the Norway maple when we talk about pollen allergies. And I know that some people get depressed by darkness in the streets, for example. With heavy canopies, they want more sunlight. What about power outages, especially long ones? Maybe those make us feel pretty bad too, don't they? And of course, there have been people injured from falling trees. I happened to be in Germany when a big storm came through in June, and several people were killed because of a tree toppling on top of a small shed that they happened to be in. So there is tree-related mortality. But I think the message needs to be that on balance, trees are far more powerful at enhancing human health than they are at degrading it. But I would argue then that when you add water to the nature that trees offer, it's doubly healthy. And that's one reason why I absolutely adore living in Halifax. Forests do matter. Thank you.
Well, I have to admit, listening to the previous speakers, I'm pretty jealous. To have a job where you explore the sensuality of wood, or the spirit of forests, or bathe in forests, sounds like very much not the world I live in. Because I live in the world that says, show me the money where forests are concerned. And as an environmental scientist, in a bank of about 90,000 very analytical people, that can be pretty daunting. But my job is really to demonstrate the business case for forests and for nature. Although we've had a very poetic evening, let's not forget that forests have formed a very strong basis of our economy since the beginning of Canada's history, and they continue to do so. They've been a natural resource and commodity that's made us what we are today. And so for me, when I'm trying to make the business case within the bank, I'm usually making the business case for why the environment and the economy are strongly linked and why a healthy environment equates to a healthy economy. And I want to give you a bit of an illustration of how I go about doing that. I'm going to follow up a little bit on what Peter talked about. I'm going to talk about the importance of urban forests. Peter has talked about a lot of the values of urban forests, but I thought it would be very interesting, given the rate of urbanization that's going on in Canada right now, to try to put a financial value on our urban green space. Now, many will say that is sacrilegious. You can't put a price on nature. But I would argue that unless we start putting a price on our natural capital, we're not looking at the full equation. We're not going to make the right decisions. So here's where our journey into natural capital valuation of urban forests has taken us. So luckily for me, I've got a world of economists that I can draw on. And our starting point on developing our business case was the premise that we have to face the fact that the world is urbanizing, and it's urbanizing rapidly. And Canada, despite all our wonderful nature, is one of the most highly urbanized countries in the world. Toronto's population is expected to double by 2036 to a level of 9.2 million. That's the size of London today. Unless you think you're going to escape that here in Halifax, Your population has grown by 50% in the last 30 years, and it's slated to grow by about 65,000 people in the next 10 years, even though the overall population of Nova Scotia is not predicted to grow. So we have to face the fact that cities are where people live, cities are what drives the economy, and cities are competing for people. The title of my speech, or my talk tonight, was actually meant to be Smart Cities, not Small Cities. So I would say that what do we need to have smart cities that attract talent, that attract industry? Well, one of the things that we need for smart cities is livable cities, and those include green space and livable neighborhoods. So we started looking at how to put a price on neighborhoods. What we did, we started with Toronto, and we looked at the value of trees both as commodities, the number of trees and what they'd be worth if you cut them down. And then we looked at a number of the environmental benefits that Peter spoke about, specifically flood control, air purification, carbon sequestration, and energy savings through shade. And starting in Toronto, here's what we found. First of all, Toronto has 10 million trees. Many of them are large, mature trees. If you cut them down, they'd have a commodity value of $7 billion, or about $700 per tree. And on top of that, each and every year they provide about $80 million of environmental benefits through flood control, air purification, carbon sequestration. That saves each and every family in Toronto $125 on their taxes. What about Halifax? We just finished taking a look at Halifax, and you'll be pleased to know that you are the tree city of Canada, with a whopping 57 million trees in municipal Halifax. That's about 140 trees per person. Take that, Toronto. Now, a lot of the trees in Halifax are smaller. So while the actual value per tree is only about $200, that nonetheless equates to a value of $11 billion for Halifax urban forests just in the commodity value. And using our same equations to calculate environmental benefits, we found that Halifax's urban forest contributes $32 million each and every year through environmental benefits, chiefly through reduction of energy use and air purification, and removes carbon equivalent to 80,000 vehicles. These are significant findings that are not typically included when we do our analysis of urban development. So my business case is we need to consider the natural capital of urban forests when we're making urban development decisions. I've only talked about the environmental benefits, and Peter has touched a little bit on the social benefits, but we all know that forests and urban green spaces are great for society, and these are a couple of pictures, I don't know whether you can see them, of a really urbanized environment, New York City, where there are programs to absolutely use creation of urban green space for social inclusion, for well-being, and to provide physical activity for children in very heavily urbanized environments. And lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about a poll that we recently did on what Canadians think about their urban green spaces. And guess what? People love their neighborhood parks. People care more about the local parks, and we were talking about it earlier. Somebody cutting a tree down in your park will attract a lot more interest than many things. So what we found in our poll is people love trees, they want more parks, they want more shade, and actually, if there are any councillors here, they really want more park benches. So, whatever we want to think about what the future may or may not look like, one thing is pretty clear. If a city is going to be successful, it's going to have trees, and it's going to have a lot of them. And based on our economic analysis, greening our neighborhoods also translates into more green in your pocket. Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Dan Kraus. I'm a scientist with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. And I guess if Jane is our chief storyteller, you can think of me as our chief nature advisor. Or I heard my kids the other day telling their friends that he helps nature out. I was thinking about what they said, he helps nature out, because I've only been with Nature Conservancy of Canada for half my career. I spent the other half doing environmental assessments for pipelines and mines and roads and country estates. And I was thinking what my kids' response would have been if I'd still been doing that work. And certainly as I grow older and watch my kids grow older, I think it's mines, country estates, pipelines are all important things. But I think nature is going to be critical for the future, and it's even more critical that we're protecting those things. So I'm here tonight because of a contest. We're actually all here tonight because of this contest. It's a contest where the winners are going to survive and the losers are going to perish. It's a contest that's going on right now, but it started 400 million years ago. The contestants are plants, and the prize is sunlight. At one time on Earth, all plants were grasses, sedges, ferns, and horsetails. Green plants that use chlorophyll to capture sunlight and turn it into food, turn it into energy. The contest was to see who could get the sunlight first. At some point and at some place, there was a grand change in the design of plants. And while these ancient green plants had always had cellulose, or wood, in their cellular toolbox, there was a change in how it was used. And instead of just using cellulose as an exterior, as a raincoat, it became incorporated into the stems of plants. This new woody structure was accompanied by a complex evolutionary makeover in the internal plumbing, and it gave these plants the ability to grow tall, to retain that structure, and to reach for the sky. Stems gave rise to wood, to trunks. This gave rise to the first trees and the first forests, and the world was changed forever. There are few other groups of species that have impacted the face of our planet as trees. We define the major life zones on our planet based on the presence or the absence of forests. From these first trees came the forests that have come to alter the chemical, physical, and biological cycles that drive our planet and are the foundations of life. These forests are rainmakers, air conditioners, water reservoirs, chemical recyclers, and keepers of biodiversity. They also became major sinks of carbon dioxide. Many of these ancient forests, particularly those that grew in wet areas, held so much carbon that after tens of millions of years of life and death, the carbon they stored then has become the coal, oil, and natural gas that we use today. Over the last hundreds of millions of years, while the amount of tree cover has shifted through the eons in response to tectonic changes, warming and cooling periods, our living planet has remained a planet with ice fields, with deserts, and with grasslands, but mostly a planet dominated by vast oceans and by vast forests. The changes we've seen more recently in our global forests have not been caused by plate tectonics or long-term climate cycles, but by me, by you, by us. We've converted almost 50% of our planet's forests into croplands, ranches, plantations, subdivisions, and highways. For much of the remainder, we've claimed them as working forests to provide us with fuel, with wood, and fiber. Indeed, our collective forest wilderness has shrunk to just a handful of places across the planet. The largest are now restricted to the tropical rainforests in the Amazon and a swath of boreal forest that extends from Alaska to Labrador, with the largest intact forest remaining on Earth straddling the border of northern Ontario and Manitoba. Now, being Canadian, it's easy to think that trees are ubiquitous, and we see our northern forests as common. Indeed, the heartland of Canada is a heartland of trees, of rocks, and of water, eh? But when we look at the world through our trees, what we hold as abundant is, from a global perspective, a rare and dwindling resource. And Canadians, as custodians of our trees, with their rocks and their water, are custodians of some of the last great forests left on Earth. Now, the story of forests in Nova Scotia, in the Maritimes, it's a little bit different than what we've so far managed to maintain in our northern boreal forests, and in some ways reflects 1,000 stories of forests from around the world. The forests in Nova Scotia and the Maritimes are incredibly diverse and varied, but scientists generally refer to them as the Acadian forest region. Red spruce, yellow birch, eastern hemlock, sugar maple, and balsam fir are all common species that you find in the Acadian forest region. Now, many of these trees are very long-lived, and it's estimated that 60 to 85% of the original Acadian forests were old growth. They were dominated by trees that had been alive for centuries. Now, the first settlers saw the rich forests of the Maritimes as an endless and inexhaustible resource. Soils in the richer lowlands were cleared for agriculture, and the region's old-growth forests were cut for timber and later for fiber. Today, although some regions have been more affected than others, little, if any, forested area has escaped human influence over the past 4 centuries. One of the key changes that scientists have noted in this Acadian forest region is a shift in age, with increased frequency of younger woodland types, with all but a few places remaining of the deep, ancient forests that once dominated this landscape. There is good news. There's very good news. Unlike other parts of the world, Atlantic Canada has retained much of its forest cover, and the amount of forest cover has actually been increasing in some places over the last few decades. And while people around the world, and even Canadians, may think of British Columbia or Quebec when they think of forested landscapes in Canada, it's actually Nova Scotia and New Brunswick that have the highest amount of forest cover of any Canadian province. Indeed, the landscape where we stand or sit right now and the neighboring provinces and U.S. states are one of the largest temperate forests remaining on Earth. The challenge now is how can we protect this forested landscape and make sure it continues to benefit nature and to benefit people. While a century of improvements in forestry practices have greatly benefited these forests, we are now seeing an attack on our forests from non-native insects, non-native plants and diseases, and continued habitat loss and fragmentation in key areas. Healthy forests in the future are going to require an investment today. Indeed, there are few better investments in the tree, few better returns than a forest. As we've been hearing, there's a growing field in ecology and in conservation related to understanding and articulating the true economic costs of nature and the true costs associated with losing species and habitats. These values have been referred to as ecological goods and services, or natural capital. It's basically putting a price tag on the free stuff that nature gives us and has always given us. And I'm sure many of you are like me and you cringe at the thought of putting the price on the shade of an ancient tree on a warm summer day, or the idea of putting a vista of a forest over a lake into a ledger book seems absurd. But when we can take an economic value of these forests, we can better communicate their benefits, and maybe most importantly, what's at stake if we lose them. As we've heard, forests provide a wide range of services. These range from cleaning water, providing habitat, to preventing floods. In some leading cities, such as New York and Halifax, they've actually linked healthy watersheds with healthy communities. The water that you drink tonight, or maybe beer if it's local, is actually safeguarded not by a complex technological system, but by reservoirs that are protected by forests. If you calculate the total value of ecosystem goods and services of all forests in Nova Scotia, and so this is not including renewable resources like timber or pulp and paper, they provide us with $2 to $6 billion in natural capital. $2 to $6 billion in natural capital a year. And if protected, they'll continue to provide this to the economy, to your children, to my children, year after year after year, forever. I have a promise for you, and I promise you that there's few other investments that will endure, that will appreciate in value or be appreciated in value as much as our forests. And I know this because we only need to look at examples where groups of people work to protect forests. Kejimkujik National Park, Gully Lake Wilderness Area, Point Pleasant Park. These are all places where people of good conscience banded together to protect and steward our forests. We don't hear of complaints that these places were protected. No one laments that there's too many trees in Kedgie, or that the forests of Point Pleasant are really a little bit too big. These are places that have come to be treasured by local communities. They provide a sense of place, they create healthy environments, they grow and support local economies, and they come to define the communities and the people that live there. In Nova Scotia and in Canada, we've been very lucky to have an abundance of forests. This abundance has meant that there's always been more. The thing is now, from a global perspective, forests aren't abundant and they continue to decline, and there isn't any more. The world we want our children to inherit is going to be based on the decisions that we make today. I encourage you to get out and learn more about the forests and the forest conservation projects we're working on at the Nature Conservancy of Canada. We can be those people of good conscience to protect the forests for our children and for the future. We can be those people that will grow the trees that will change the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. If I could ask all our panelists to come up, actually, and take a seat on stage, maybe get a drink of water for a second, and just ask our audience members now to start thinking about some of the questions you may have for some of our panelists as soon as we get them settled. I think there's a lot raised in that discussion, and a lot that we can begin to broaden out with questions. And actually, while we wait, I do want to point your attention to not this particular picture, but several other pictures that have been on the screen during the course of our presentation this evening. There's pictures done by a local photographer called Mike Dembeck. Mike is here with us tonight, and Mike has been tremendously generous with some of his contributions photographically and in terms of video to the Nature Conservancy of Canada. So personal thanks to Mike for some of the fabulous stuff that we've been able to utilize. Thank you, Mike. Everybody ready? Terrific. Okay, so what I do is now invite you to help us continue this conversation. If you have a question, there are a couple of mic stands on the floor. I know there's one here in the middle. What other two? I don't see the second one. Help to my staff here. Anyway, there's one here in the middle, and we'll ask you to make your way to the microphone so we can all hear the question. And perhaps if you could address it to a specific panelist, and we'll get the response and then maybe some feedback. As you think about those questions and perhaps get yourself to the microphone, maybe I'll kick off just to warm the panel up a little bit here. Dan, in your presentation you discussed, you said that healthy forests in the future require heavy investments today, and that forests we take for granted as being abundant, but they aren't necessarily abundant. And I think some of the graphics you showed tonight really demonstrated that. So I'd ask our panelists to think a little bit about, as you look into the future, are you an optimist or a pessimist when it comes to our forests? Dan, maybe you want to kick off.
Sure, I can start that off. Some of the conservation of forests has really been by default. I mean, so much of forest conservation depends on commodity prices. But when you look across most of Canada, where forests can be converted to agriculture, over the last century, you have seen an increase in the amount of forest cover. It's partly been because of good conservation, that's been growing. It's also partly been because of changing agricultural practices, where farmers, because they're using tractors and not a horse and plow, they can't go on to steep slopes or wet areas anymore. But generally, there's been an increase in forest across the country in some of our more settled landscapes. So I think as we start to appreciate and communicate the values of that more, I think that there is hope for optimism. There's always going to be places where we are going to see trees being cut down in parks, or areas being cleared for development, but I think we do kind of need to take that provincial or regional picture and take some hope, just because they have been increasing, and if we put more effort into it, they should continue to.
Any of our other panelists? Yes, Peter.
When I think about our urban forests, I have a great deal of optimism. I talk to a lot of urban foresters and a lot of people associated with urban forests, and they so desperately want more trees and a better quality urban forest, and there are a lot of programs that are building up to create them. When I think of our hinterland forests, particularly in the far north, I have a great deal of pessimism, and it lies squarely at the foot of climate change, because I don't think they're going to do well over the next couple of 100 years unless we wrestle climate change to the ground.
Jeff?
One of the advantages we have in Nova Scotia and all three of the maritime provinces, the high percentage of private ownership that gives a very, in some ways, by family traditions at least, a very steadfast forest value, where Crown land is more subject to the push and pull of not so specific a set of values. And I think there is optimism because of the private land holdings in the Maritime Province.
Anne or Karen, did you want to comment on optimism or pessimism for the future?
Well, just a brief point, and that is that I think education is a huge factor here. And so, you know, we do have to educate ourselves. All of us have to educate ourselves about what it is we can do, because each of us can do something. So I feel strongly about education as a factor in this.
Karen?
I think I agree with pretty much everything that's been said. I guess the only thing I would add, maybe picking up specifically on Anne's point, you know, knowledge is power, and we know in Canada an awful lot. Most of it, much of it through having done some of the wrong things, but we do know how to be good stewards of our forests, and we do in our urban environments treasure our forests. And I guess my wish, and I don't know whether I'm optimistic, but I do feel we should be putting out a standard that we should be trying to move through other parts of the world, because I think those are the parts of the world where they don't have the luxury or necessarily yet the knowledge to understand the importance of preservation of forest ecosystems.
Thank you. I'll turn to the audience. Questions from the audience. Yes, please step forward.
There, thanks very much to everyone. It was inspiring. Karen, I have a question for you. Of the economic arguments that are being made in order to attempt to value the trees, which ones are you finding resonate the most with various sectors? So either, you know, municipal decisions being made, private sector decisions being made. So that's the first question. The second is, are there particular leaders who are championing this within the forestry industry? And if so, you know, who are those people?
So we'll start with the first question. Karen.
And I might answer the first half, and there might be others who are more qualified on the forest industry. I would say in the work that we've been doing on natural capital, we are getting a lot of pickup from municipal leaders because they do recognize that a lot of times decisions around urban development perhaps link into tax base. You know, if we build a nice big condo like we seem to do every day in Toronto now, we're going to get X tax base, and so that will make the decision pretty easy. But if you can actually start putting onto the table in their language, i.e. financial terms, the actual benefits that are going to accrue from not only protecting but increasing urban green space, then I feel that we are having a lot of positive receptivity at that municipal level.
And any reaction to Karen's first answer? No? Then the second part of the question was forest leaders, and are there any forest leaders that you would like to highlight or talk about? Within the industry, I believe the question was.
I'm not going to name names, but part of the reason to be optimistic is that I think over the last decade, there has actually been leadership around forest stewardship from the industry. And, you know, some are certainly better than others, but I think in response to consumer demands to have sustainably harvested products, To know that our toilet paper is not coming from, ancient trees. There has been, some people think it's too slow, but when you look at it over like the past 10 or 20 years, quite a good response from industry to try to have forest practices where it is sustainable and where it is better stewardship of our forests. So, things are changing. It's sometimes very slow, but when you look at the trajectory of the good stewardship practices that are being introduced, it gives me a lot of hope for what we'll have in the future.
Jeff?
As a maker in the retail environment, I'm thoroughly impressed by times at what people do know and what people don't know about products made of wood, not made of wood. I have colleagues in northern New Brunswick who are making thinner. That's the goal right now, is to produce thinner, where so much of my world is about optimum thickness for a variety of reasons. This business, courtesy of contacts from the West Coast, courtesy of the Far Eastern market, are producing from green board 0.4 millimeter thick veneers that go immediately through a dryer, and in 3 minutes plus packaging are ready for shipping to China to be adhered in. Now 0.4 is green. It's drying down from 0.4 millimeters to be shipped over and spun back here, glued to, do you all know what that stuff is glued to? Is a stair tread with glued thin wood on it worth anything? These are the questions that all of us as retail consumers can be of great assistance with. Is no, that's no good. I'll not buy that. Why is it in your store? Not my store.
Anybody else want to talk to that? Yes, Anne.
Well, I keep forgetting the microphone, but the woman who asked the question, I can't say anything about Canada and the leaders in forestry in Canada, but I do know that Norway is a leader around the world, and is, you probably know that it is putting millions into the country of Guyana so that it won't deforest its, so that it won't cut down its trees. And so this is a 3-year, what will happen after Norway stops paying Guyana, I don't know. It's only for 3 years, but it is a way to lead the rest of the world.
Jeff?
Value added comes in many levels and many scales. I know of a flooring company in Scandinavia, 5 generations. They've got the photographs. It's a remarkable uptake. They have buyers buying singular trees, 1 tree at a time they're buying throughout Europe and Russia to produce this flooring that is 18 inches wide, 30 feet long, single pieces. Oh my God, it's going to shrink. It's going to expand. Oh my God. Yet, I've had Europeans in my little store on Agricola Street say, well, people take their wooden floors with them when they move, because they float. They don't need to be nailed, screwed, blued, and tattooed. They are part of what a family lives with. Where are our collective heads about what we do and don't work with? Back to this family of 5 generations, producing by the piece flooring that is the equivalent of a multi-generational ownership, be it the building or be it the family. How do we consider the products that we could raise in forests by careful selection of the range of products from, yes, we can use that low-grade material for certain things while we nurture this tree to become what it can become. But it's way beyond my grandchildren's lives. And we have to wrap our minds around that kind of thinking.
Peter, did you?
When the question was first asked, I wanted to avoid it because I wanted to kind of say that there is no leadership anywhere. But that's actually wrong. And when I think about Nova Scotia, over the last 5 or 10 years, the conversations I'm having and the processes I'm involved in, I'm seeing leadership in 3 places. I'm seeing leadership in the woodlot owner organizations that seem so bent on trying to help woodlot owners do the right thing. And so I get a lot of inspiration from hanging out with guys who run woodlot owner organizations. I am getting a lot of inspiration from watching community forests across Canada flourish, and we have a fledgling one here in Nova Scotia that everybody should get behind and see to it that that thing succeeds. And when it does, and I'm saying when, not if, it's going to be show dramatic leadership in forest management in Nova Scotia. And thirdly, because I've been associated with it for so long and I've been its chair, the model forests of Canada have shown great leadership, and in this province, the Nova Forest Alliance. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions from the floor? Please come, don't be shy, come on up.
Hi, so I had a question for Peter. You mentioned you made a paper last year for the trees in the city. I was curious what impact that made. Did you get more trees? Did you conserve more? And also, what can we do to make an impact to help sustain the trees or bring more to the city?
If I understood the first part of your question, it's whether the paper we wrote had any impact? Yep. Probably none. I'm not a very good communicator. I write well for the journals, I think, the academic journals, and I think my students understand what I tell them in class. But I can't, for the life of me, communicate to the public very well. And I thought that communicating a brochure on forest values would be receptive to literate leaders. And I have no clue whether this has been taken up except for in one town in all of this country, and it's an hour up the highway from here. The forester in Truro said, "Send me more. I want this for my counselor and for other people." So I haven't got a clue, but my suspicion is very low. What can citizens do to urge on the improvement of the urban forest? Your counselor is key. And I would say, get on the case of your counselor in a very non-confrontational and helpful way. Volunteer with organizations that are engaged in improvement of the urban forest. For example, there are a couple of community tree plants happening in this city in the next weeks. It'd be wonderful to see a lot of people out not only enjoying each other's company in nature, but participating in establishing new tree growth in the city.
Any other comments? No? Questions? Yes, please come on up.
Hello, everyone. So I guess going off of what Peter was just discussing, this question will be addressed to the whole panel. In terms of going forward with conserving these areas, do you think the greatest change or our greatest hope will come from private conservation or from that of government?
Private or public? Government. Karen.
I'm going to talk about the urban aspect. I think the working forest is different, but certainly one of the things that we've been taking a great interest in is trying to work on this puzzle of knowing that people in the community want more green space and are willing to roll up their sleeves and go out and plant trees. As Peter had alluded to, and I mean, we through Friends of the Environment Foundation plant 50,000 trees a year. We know people want to participate. We know municipal governments don't have a lot of money. So one of the things that we've been working with, taking a bit of a cue from some of the foundations in the States, are to come up with new formulas for maintaining and growing urban green space that would be more along the lines of public-private partnerships. And there are There are some really, really great examples in the U.S. For example, Central Park in New York City is maintained by a Friends of Central Park, which works in concert with the New York Parks Department, with volunteers providing maintenance and donation and all of that sort of thing. So I think there is actually a huge scope for us to take a really good look at the models of how we're managing our urban green space now, recognize we can't just do it out of tax dollars, and that we need to find a way of having more inclusive models. And I'm really hopeful that that will happen.
Peter, whose responsibility is it?
Sorry?
Whose responsibility is it? Public, private, government?
To speak about forests that are not urban, rural and hinterland forests, the relative importance of government versus private sector, I think, depends very heavily on the ownership pattern of the woods. In the province of Prince Edward Island, there's hardly any crown land, so the private sector and the municipal sector have to be the leaders. In southern Ontario, for example, the municipalities and the private sector must be the leaders, and in northern Ontario, it more or less must be government, where some 80 to 90% of the forests of Ontario are publicly owned. Here in Nova Scotia, we have somewhere around 30% public ownership, 20% in industrial land, and 50% in small private woodlots. So that responsibility has to be shared more or less across industry, woodlots, government, and the civil sector.
Yeah, just to echo Peter, I think the other important actors in that are industry, and in some places First Nations play a critical role in protecting and stewarding our forests. And it kind of seems like a cop-out saying, well, you know, we all need to work on it. But the reason is when you look at the factors for success in conservation, there's sort of 3 or 4 things that you need. And the one is identifying and protecting key areas of biodiversity. And that's something the Nature Conservancy of Canada is very good at. One of the cool projects we did was to create an eco-regional plan for the Acadian Forest region, working with partners to identify some of the key places, some private, some government, or some crown land that need to be protected. The other factor is having a sustainable land use within that matrix of protected land. So, you know, it's one thing to have great protected areas, but if it's terrible, unsustainable land use in between, it really diminishes the value. So we need to have, you know, working forests that are sustainable, or providing us with the products we need, but are also complementing those protected areas that we need. And the other 2 factors we need are having sort of strong institutional support. So there has to be provincial, national, local government policies that support good practices, and then the community needs to be involved, and there has to be kind of that community that cares about what's happening and works to support that.
Jeff?
Yeah, where I was going to come in was right on the heels of community. The voters, the people involved in helping public policy being intertwined with big business, it really is going to require even more of a community discussion. That's all of you guys.
Thank you. I think with that, we will wrap up the stage portion of our evening, but the discussion will continue next door. I'd like to close off this portion by thanking again our sponsor, TD, for making this possible. Thank you for your questions and for your interest and for joining us here this evening. Can I have a warm round of applause, please, for all our panelists? Thank you. Karen Clarke-Whistler from TD Bank Group, and Simpson, poet and writer, Dan Kraus from the Nature Conservancy of Canada, Peter Duinker from Dalhousie University, and Jeff Amos from Amos Wood Design. Thank you so much for taking your time and bringing your passion and on something that you truly care about and communicating that with us this evening. I would now like to invite you all to join us next door at the Chrysler Pavilion. We have some snacks and beverages, and we can continue the conversation. And if you just sort of head out that way, our staff will guide you to the refreshments. Thank you again. Good night.